Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS episode 22. And the first thing I'd love to do is say hello to Kairin van Sweden. Hi, Kairin, how are you doing?
Hi, William, how are you?
I'm very well, and welcome to everyone who's watching. We're now going out onto Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can comment, and we'd love you to do that. Either if you want to say anything about the show or anything that you've been up to or what you've been thinking is of interest to you and the world of economics and Scotland, please do comment. Kairin, what have you been up to this week, and what type of thing have you been reading?
So I think really interestingly, I've hearing this from a couple of sources, the massive amount of wealth that's being passed down between families in America. It's estimated that 21 trillion of dynastic wealth will pass internally between now and 2045 between these wealthy families in America. So this is mad. This is crazy.
So money from the incredibly wealthy going to their kids who will obviously maintain and build on that wealth. That's a huge amount, unbelievable. And that's just in the States. So you can kind of extrapolate that for the 1% across the other global north. Wow, that's a huge amount.
Yep. And the other big thing I think that's happening just now is talk about windfall tax here in the UK, because obviously the oil companies, huge profits. Let me see. So it was 9.5 billion for BP, 14.5 billion for Shell, and 16.5 billion for Exxon. So these are huge figures.
Absolutely. It'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next few days, maybe the next couple of weeks around windfall tax. Okay, great. Well, first thing before we do an introduction is to say thanks to the National and Bella Caledonia, who've both done pieces on the interview that we did with David McWilliams. As you all know, it takes a lot of time and effort, especially trying to get someone who's as popular and as busy as David McWilliams. And we did a little bite-size cut of our full-length episode, which we're going to watch tonight, and that's had over 2,000 views. So it's really supportive when we have people within the independence movement, people who are interested in Scottish economics and Scottish politics, to share some of the content. So thanks very much. And I would say if you're a member of an independent-minded group or political party or branch, it would be really good if you could say to them, could you share these programs that we've got, especially the bite-sized interviews? And if they're not sharing them, I think it'd be really good to ask them why they're not sharing them, because I'm sure if you've seen that bite-size, it's all positive and it's coming from someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight. And I think that's incredibly important as we're getting hopefully towards a referendum. So please do share and enjoy this. We've got 52-minute in-depth interview with David McWilliams, and we'll also do a little link to the bite side afterwards. But please do comment as we're going through the interview that we did with David a couple of weeks ago. Kairin, do you want to say anything before we get going?
Yeah, so I was going to introduce David, but I should probably mention to the audience as well, there's a little bit of a disagreement between myself and David during this interview, so be prepared for that. So David,
I had some disagreements as well, but I cut them out. Yours is in there. So I'm sure people will appreciate watching that.
So David McWilliams he's an economist, he's an author, he's a journalist and a documentary maker and a broadcaster. And he is also adjunct professor of global economics at the School of Business at Trinity College, Dublin. And he is ranked as the 10th most influential economist in the world.
Great. And if you do go through some of the Twitter feeds, you'll see that people were suggesting that he's a man of no importance and no knowledge around this area, which just shows you the type of thing that we're really up against when we're trying to bring independent voices to give their opinion on Scotland and the economy. I hope you enjoy it, and please do comment and let us know as we get into the episode. Here it is. David McWilliams, thank you so much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS as part of our Small Nation series. It's brilliant to have you spend some time with us today.
Not at all. Not at all. It's a pleasure. You know, as somebody whose great grandparents are Scottish, my dad was Scottish, my grandparents are Scottish, his great grandparents are from Oost, miles away, up the bloody, up in the Hebrides.
There's so many connections between Scotland and Ireland, and that's really what we wanted to look at today as part of the Small Nation series. So
usually it's Irish people go into Scotland. There's very few Scots coming the other way. I think our family was just this weird crowd who said, "Oh, there she goes."
No. There's a big Irish diaspora in the west coast of Scotland.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. My great grandfather was Irish. Yeah, absolutely.
The Van Swedens of Donegal.
No, that's my husband's name.
It's a great letter Kenny name, the Van Swedens.
No, Robertson's my maiden name. Robertson. Yeah.
Great. Anyway, no, it's great. It's great. It's lovely to talk to both of you.
What would be really good to start is for you to give us a flavour of the Irish economy as we enter kind of 2022. I mean, what underpins the economy, its size, the general flows, and where does the wealth of the nation come from?
I think it's a very, very good question, and it goes to the root, I presume, of what Scotland might be about to embark on. The wealth of Ireland is now significant, reasonably evenly spread. If you look at things, for example, called the Gini coefficient in economics, Ireland is probably bang in the European average. Britain, now that it's not even counted anymore in the European average, Britain is a little bit below, Germany a little bit above. So in general, the wealth after tax and public spending is reasonably well spread on an income basis. On a wealth basis, it's not. So the very, very wealthy are still profoundly wealthy in comparison to the average. But what is fascinating is the journey that Ireland has been on since I was a kid. So we were born in Ireland in the late 1960s. My generation just managed to make it into the Gen Xers, which is kind of nice because you really don't want to be a boomer these days. And
we're next. Don't worry, we're next.
Yeah, but we were born into I remember when I was in university, the Economist magazine led with a big article about Ireland, and it had a picture of a woman begging on O'Connell Street was the front page, and it said Ireland, the poorest of the rich. So we were a poor country in a rich area, and all my university class emigrated, myself included. None of us felt that there was a future in our country, that a future that was material for us. And then it turned around. And then the question is, how did that happen? So to give you a snapshot now, the GDP of the country is a little bit jaundiced by multinational figures. So there's a GNI. We can use a couple of figures, all of which show that the Irish income is around 300 billion plus per year, which is a phenomenal figure for a small country. It's also a phenomenal figure from a country that used to be very, very poor. We now have the highest rate of immigration in Europe. We have a higher percentage of foreign-born people than anywhere else in Europe, including the UK. We don't have, as of yet, a very significant anti-immigration urge, although I think that will probably emerge. The key story in Ireland was the following. When you go independent, we went independent 100 years ago, this yesterday, which is good opposite. And we had no money and no capital and no networks and no industry. So you start with an aspiration. And as I've said to Brexiteers, Irish people, we can really understand their yearning for flags and sovereignty and all that good stuff. But bit of advice is, I understand that the first 70 years is the hardest, and then it gets easier after that. And our first 70 years was very hard. We made lots and lots of mistakes. We became a theocracy. We became far too Catholic, far too rigid. We scared people away, all that sort of stuff. We did everything. If you had actually taken like a blank piece of paper, as I have here, and said what not to do, we did all that stuff, right? But you learn from your mistakes, and we've learned from our mistakes. And the key thing is, when you have no capital, you have to make it cheap. So how do you make it cheap? You have to get other people to deploy capital in your jurisdiction that you don't have. So you tax it less. I mean, it's the basic idea. And once you tax it less, capital and money flows very much like water. It flows in the path of least resistance. So if you put up resistance to it, i.e. taxing it a lot or putting conditions on it, then it won't come near you because capital has many, many options. But if you actually make it very easy to deploy capital here, then it'll come. And as a result of that, there are about 400,000 Irish people who work in multinationals. They have a much higher income per head. They have much better working conditions, despite, and it's interesting, having no union representation. Most American multinationals do not allow trade unions, but the working conditions in the main are much, much better than they are in the local economy. And the reason is productivity is very high. So once you have very, very high levels of productivity, because you have very high level of productivity, because you have very high levels of capital in those places. That's one growth story. But I'd like to think it's much more interesting than that. I think that the major change in Ireland, and I suspect Scotland will have to go through this too, is a change with respect to risk taking and a change with respect to small and even micro entrepreneurship. So when I was a kid, when the Catholic Church were extremely dominant here, and the state was very dominant too, wrapped in a sort of a nationalist idea that this was our way forward, was actually looking backwards. That level of dogma in the society had a number of effects, but the main one, I believe, from the economic perspective, is it drove away people who were dissenters, people who dissented from conventional opinion, and people who were actually very creative. And those people ended up in London or New York or any of those places. In Scotland, some of them, but I'm talking about the late 1990s, early 2000s. So we had this bizarre situation. We educated lots of people. We gave them the self-confidence to be different, self-confidence to do things for themselves, and yet we imposed upon them a very strict moral dogma. Now, I believe there's a significant relationship between morality and economics, between freedom and economics, between liberalism and tolerance and embracing those who are different. And if you look at our society, the major difference in Ireland, I believe, in the last 30 years, is that people who were hunted out of the country for being gay, for example, for having different attitudes towards Catholic social thinking, those people now live here and they're welcomed here. And what you see is, I think that commercial self-expression and individual sexual self-expression, moral self-expression, political, are one and the same things. That the type of people who create companies are by very definition unusually cussed, strange, iconoclastic folk, right? They don't want a boss, they don't want a job, they don't want a wage, they don't want insurance, they don't want anything telling them what to do. They are the dissenters. And unless and until you make them welcome in society, those dissenters will leave, and you will be left with a population that doesn't want to back themselves in the great journey, what I would call, of, the modern economy. So I see most Irish economists say we attracted in foreign capital, and that's what the story is. And that's what I would call it, the big man in history idea. I'm much more interested in the little woman in history. What actually happened on the ground level that changed the society? So the big man in history says some very, very clever civil servant pulled a lever, and as a result, it's a kind of hydraulic Keynesianism, right? And as a result of that, the economy grew. That is part of the story. But I would say a much more interesting part is the relationship between sexual and social tolerance and acceptance and economic growth. And what you see in Ireland is a correlation between when we became tolerant and when we became rich is very, very close. So that, I would believe, is part of the story too, that you cannot divorce the economy from the social context therein. And dogma is very, very, very bad for economics, right? No matter what dogma it is, because what you do is you exclude a huge part. So to tell you, the snapshot of the Irish economy is growth is strong, wealth generation is strong. Most people put that down to the multinationals. I would say there's another story, which is that wealth generation comes from innovation, and innovation comes from creative people who get up in the morning and say, I can do something better. I can figure things out, and they back themselves. So it's a strange combination of social tolerance and economic exuberance that has actually, I think, driven the story here, as opposed to just the simple, there's lots of multinationals.
Yeah. So do you think that's the secret then of blending that what people were doing with the capital that was coming into the country at the right time that has made Ireland so peculiar? I mean, Ireland's GDP is bigger than Norway's, and it's 50% bigger than Scotland. So it looks like there's something very peculiar has happened in Ireland.
Well, let's use the GNI figure, which tries to take out this multinational impact. Well, I think the world is so complicated, so complex, that no one reason can explain why X or Y happens. That we live in a world of the law of unintended consequences, that even the best laid plans get changed. So I'm much more a believer in sort of this rather new idea of evolutionary economics. I'm much more persuaded by that than any of the stuff I learned, and unfortunately I teach, but we're going to change that. And so therefore, I think that there have been numerous occasions where countries grow very, very quickly. Ironically, Northern Ireland grew incredibly quickly between about 1870 and 1920, and that region, driven by a lot of, well, rather similar things, except they had the British Empire, and the British Empire is a very, very good example of making pretty shit products in Britain and forcing people to buy them around the world, which is why that once the British Empire collapsed, British manufacturing collapsed, because it wasn't actually good.
But during that time as well, they were stopping the home nations making any of competitive products. So it wasn't just that the products were crap, it's the only thing that you could actually get a hold of as well. Yeah, so it's a fantastic strategy. You can't knock it, that's for sure.
Yeah, so
in terms of a business.
And I think so Northern Ireland bought into that big time. And then when that kind of quasi-protectionist structure collapsed, things went backwards. So, I wouldn't. The interesting thing is countries can also get poor very quickly. So any casual observer of Latin America will know that Uruguay was the Switzerland of Europe. It had universal suffrage. It had a free public health system, free public education system in the teens, right, and in the 1920s. And it's like Argentina was the 7th or 8th richest country in the world, and then it went backwards. So really bad things can happen to countries as well as really good things. So we've got to be very aware of that.
You actually interviewed a Russian recently who made the very succinct point that economics is really important, of course, and I think more of our politicians have to have a better grasp on it. But fundamentally, if you don't have good democracy, this is also a big problem for any country as well, if the democracy is poor. And you certainly can see that right now in the UK, in Westminster right now. That's very, very clear. Going back to the point that Ireland became independent from the UK, and do you think that at that time that people were just so desperate to be released from the oppressor that they didn't really have a plan economically? Because obviously once you became independent, you could have your own currency, you could mobilize your real resources, and in the case of Ireland, you had lots and lots of young people to mobilize. So do you think that there just was a lack of imagination about what you could do once you were independent.
Yeah, I think there were basically two options open to Ireland. Most independence movements, if you look at history, went down the sort of Marxist route very, very quickly. And it makes sense, because if you take the Marxist view that imperialism is the pinnacle of capitalism, well, then if you actually try and decolonize, you will naturally shift resources and nationalize them, and that goes with a suite of beliefs. Ireland was unusual in that regard, that it didn't do that. We were governed by an incredibly conservative administration in the first 10 or 15 years, most clearly evidenced, and this is important for Scotland, by our retention of sterling as the anchor currency in Ireland until 1979, right? So the Irish punt was valued 1-to-1 for sterling and never devalued against sterling. And the fear was that if we were to devalue against sterling, we would get the tiny amount of capital we had would fly to London. So in order to just even keep that pool of capital here, we had to keep the value of the currency attached to the currency of the oppressor, ironically. So that would have severely limited our scope to involve ourselves in any sort of pump priming left-wing ideas. But that, be that as it may, the first governments built a huge amount of social housing. They remained democratic in the 1930s, which I think of small nations, none did in the 30s, actually, except for Ireland. I don't think there's any small nation in Europe that managed to remain democratic. So that's quite an achievement. Fianna Fáil, which were the gunmen, the so-called Sinn Féin at the time, came into the tent and actually remained true to democracy. So these are good things. But the problem for us was that we got taken over by a theocracy, and that sent us backwards for a long time. But I mean, the independence, to come back to independence, a country can't grow up unless it's independent. That's the key, right? Like, there's nothing that focuses your mind more than a budget constraint. And there's nothing that tells you how you're doing more than a bond market, right? So if you've got to get up every morning and you want to build something, you've got to go out and borrow it. And you've got to say to people, listen, give us a few quid. What rate of interest do you think we're going to charge you? It's when I look at the regions of the United Kingdom, the countries in the United Kingdom, I just think they've been completely emasculated by London. I mean, it's been an extraordinary. It's extraordinary for me to look at Scotland, which was attracting, and we talked about the Irish diaspora in Scotland. The reason Irish people are in Scotland was because it was a good bloody place to go, right? It was a place that had industry. There was a place that, and what I see is, and again, having worked in the City of London and going up to the Scottish financial centres of Edinburgh and talking to the Scottish widows type people, kind of po-faced Eastern Scots, not that I disliked them, but there was a certain.
It's different in Edinburgh and Ireland. In Glasgow, yes, it is.
They really did. I mean, I'd never really been aware of it because my grandparents never talked about it, and they were a mix. They were half Prads, half Catholics. So they actually came to Ireland because Ireland was actually. It's amazing to think about it. They came to Ireland before the First World War because Dublin was more tolerant of their marriage than Glasgow would have been, which is kind of mental, right? But I remember going to Aberdeen and Edinburgh, particularly Edinburgh, and having these Scottish people who sounded English that I couldn't understand that first. And secondly, they all these weird names, they kind of first names that were second names and second names that were first names, like Murray Campbell or Campbell Money. And I was like, anyway, but they were the last vestiges of the Scottish finance industry in the late 90s, right? It's still there, but it's not as important. But what I could never understand about Scotland was how the country wasn't like Ireland. It didn't feel dynamic. Didn't feel effervescent. It felt, pretty rich by European standards, pretty well off, but the renaissance, the cultural renaissance that I kind of expected to feel, I didn't, and I think that comes down to not being independent. I really do. Like the thing about independence, it's like being a child. You make lots of mistakes. Sometimes you grow quickly. Sometimes your growth is stunted. Sometimes you do stupid things. But you're a sovereign creature.
Yeah. And there's no one to blame.
That's the
and that's a huge issue with Scotland, is that whether it's right or wrong, and it is in some instances and not in others, there's always someone to blame. And when you're independent, there isn't anyone to blame, and that completely changes your focus on everything that you do.
Okay, I would say I was born in the same year as you, and Scotland changed a lot after devolution. It changed massively. I lived in London as well. I moved there for the same reasons. Lack of economic opportunity here in Scotland. Lots of opportunity down there. London loves Scottish, Irish people. They work hard. So they're always getting employed down there in the early 90s when I was living there. So, but when I returned to Scotland, and again, also being in the Netherlands for 5 years, Scotland transformed after devolution. So I see a lot of positive changes. So I think more can come through independence and being a currency issuer as opposed to a currency user.
Very much so. You give people responsibility and people respond. That's just as old as the hills. We know this.
As long as we get enough people who want it. We've got to have enough people who want it. So according to Brian O'Boyle and Kairin Allen, the authors of Tax Haven Ireland, they think that Ireland is a tax haven. What's your feeling about that? And what's the impact the global minimum corporation tax going to have on Ireland?
Well, first of all, the global minimum corporation tax is going to make our tax revenue rise. That's the first thing, right? Because any country that raises income, look, Ireland has signed up to this global minimum tax, right? So therefore, you're not a tax haven, right? You're actually saying, yeah, we're going to do this, right? Did Ireland use tax as an advantage? Absolutely. Should every small country use it? Absolutely, right? Tax is a policy, right? It's not something that is a given. Now, the question is, the two authors you mentioned are also, as far as I remember, and certainly Kairin is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, right? I've done a gig with Kairin. I like him, right? And I've done gigs with them. So they're coming from an anti-capital view, right? That's their DNA. I get that, but I suspect that colors their judgment, right? Will foreign capital pull out of Ireland if and when our tax rate goes to 15% and therefore is like everybody else's? No, because once, and this again comes out, the globalized world is a world of where sovereignty is less than watertight. It's a world of the free flow of people and the free flow of capital and the free flow of ideas. And I can't see the situation emerging where Ireland becomes profoundly unattractive for American capital. I really can't see that. I also don't think that it's an either-or, that if the capital comes from the United States, that in some way it has a home to go to. This seems to me to be a bizarrely domesticated view of how the world works, right? Is that vast majority of capital in the world is homeless, right? It's actually homeless. So this idea that when we talk about it, that Ireland wouldn't change our exchange rate because we had this tiny little pool of capital, we didn't want to lose it. That's like 19th century thinking. We're now in a completely different world, and the socialist workers guys need to get with that idea. I don't think that some of their objectives and some of their criticisms are not absolutely valid. They are, but I'm not sure that Ireland is a tax haven, but I do think that Ireland needs to close down brass plate companies, Russian companies with, we've got to close that shit down because that doesn't do us any favors. However, give me a small country that doesn't use its tax and I'll give you an idiotic country.
Do you think that Ireland has become too centralised around Dublin? Yeah. And has there been much spreading of the civil service around the country?
But if you look, I mean, you talk about Netherlands. Netherlands has got an extraordinary disparate population. They have many, many cities of 100,000, right? Right? When I say many, I'm talking dozens, right? Now, that shows in a tiny country an amazing ability not to allow Amsterdam suck in all the resources, or Rotterdam. Denmark, likewise, you know, so substantial small cities, 80,000, 90,000 with their own industries. Ireland has got a centralizing weakness, and it stems largely from the dominance of our form of government. I think that we have a very, very elaborate PR system, but the default position is those fellas up in Dublin, right? And I think that in the future, for example, because we've got to deal with the small difficulty of Northern Ireland quite soon, that Ireland will become, or should look at the Swiss model of direct democracy and deep federalization to, for a variety of reasons, one of which is to give Northern Irish unionists a different option, that they could be actually almost self-governing within a new structure. So I think that would be, I think we're far too centralized. There were efforts to decentralize the civil service. I think they were kind of Mickey Mouse efforts, but I suspect that if a new government were to come in and were to really think about decentralizing the civil service, it would make a huge difference. Because it's a small country, you know, it's got a good road network now, didn't have for many years. And you can do that decentralization very, very easily. And, you know, this Zoomy sort of carry on and all that. So I would hope that we move that way and look at the Netherlands or Denmark as a good model.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that you talk about a lot in your podcast as well is the housing crisis. And is this, again, something that's really particular to Dublin, or is this a crisis that's shared across the whole of the Republic?
Well, it's really a rental crisis. That's where things have really got out of whack for many, many people. Well, it is both a rental and a price. Yeah, it is Dublin centric. And again, decentralization would definitely change that. I mean, the west of Ireland, the south of Ireland, is a gorgeous place to live. Not if you bloody commute every day in your Honda Civic up and down the road. So I think that, you know, the housing crisis, and here Scotland is an exemplar. You know, Scotland has, and certainly up until recently, built lots and lots of council houses, lots and lots of state houses. In fact, I read a statistic that Scotland is second only to the former Soviet Union in Europe in the amount of people who live in state housing. We look at Glasgow, we look at the prices in Glasgow, and we think, wow, that's so cheap. Rents, house prices, etc. You know, unless and until we build more houses for poor people, and ironically, more houses for rich people, we won't solve it, because there is a shunting on effect. You know, if you don't, and again, a lot of the arguments, a lot of people think, you know, why are we building posh apartments on the Dublin docklands for rich folk? And the first thing I would say is, look, we are not building anything. Some developers are building them. That's the first thing. Second thing is, we've got lots of evidence from Finland, which keep very good data on this, shows that if you build posh houses, if you don't build posh houses, right, the people who have that income then fight the middle ground for those houses. And the people in the middle ground fight for the houses that used to be workers' houses, and the poor workers end up homeless. So there's a shunting on effect. So even if you build really posh houses for rich people, it has an amelioration effect, because those people are then out of the public market. So I would think Scotland's quite a good example of continuing to build state houses for ordinary people and people below a certain threshold of income. Now, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but it does seem to me that you don't have a housing crisis like we do.
What about your healthcare system, David? Is it moving towards privatisation? Is it semi-privatised? What's going on with the healthcare system in Ireland?
I've always found this very interesting question, dealing with people who live under the NHS. No other country in the world has a system like the NHS, which is very, I mean, people in Britain have said the only religion that British people believe in is the NHS, right? For me, my relations in Northern Ireland, for example, my in-laws, right? A public health system underpinned by private insurance is actually the norm, right? This is the German system, the French system, the Italian system. Everyone has it, right? Britain, this idea of free at the point of entry is really bizarre, and it's very, very outdated, it seems to me. And the reason it is you like Britain has the worst outcomes in COVID, the worst by a country mile. Is there a reflection of the health system? I don't know, but you have to ask a few questions. So basically, you've got two ways of doing it, right? If you're free at the point of access, you basically have very long queues, and people die needlessly because they're queuing, right? And people suffer needlessly because they're queuing. And the way in which you ration out the resource that is health is you basically say, we all wait. So I'm always amazed in Northern Ireland how long people wait for operations, right? Basic operations, particularly the elderly. So then you've got a situation like Ireland where you have half the country pays private insurance. We have medical cards for people who can't afford or who are under a certain threshold. And we've sort of sliced up the health system. Now that leads to lots of people say it's a two-tier health system. I think it probably is. Okay, I think it probably is. I think that if you're very, very rich, you'll get seen quicker than if you're very, very poor. But I think that underpinning this is a much more efficient health system in terms of access. Because what you have is you have the private side get seen quickly, liberating resources for the public side. So I'm not sure. I would think the German model is much more interesting for us than the NHS. And the German model is full private and employee contributed health service. I can't see how the other one works efficiently.
Well, I think if you...
I know this is shocking for people.
Enough money and resources into it as well, and resources is an important thing as well.
Look, you know, in Northern Ireland, on average, people take 9 times more pills than the South. Why?
Right.
Because they're free.
Yeah, but that could also be down to the demographics and what's going on with their health as well. So I'm going to disagree with you on the NHS.
I know you would, but I just find the cult of the NHS, when you contrast with the outcomes of the NHS vis-a-vis any other health services in Europe, it's appalling. So it's clearly not a model for anybody. It's an ideological, totemic structure that British people hold on to because they've largely not thought about the rest of the world. And that's a problem with Britain, is this insularity of thinking. So they don't know what happens in Germany. They don't know what happens in Holland. They've never asked a Danish person, do they pay for private insurance? The Danish person says, yeah, of course we do. That's how it works.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did live in the Netherlands, and they've changed to a more privatized system. And my husband feels that the Netherlands is a less friendly place to live in now. So that's his opinion. But I have to disagree with you about the NHS. I think it's massively underfunded. But
using insurance as a way of paying for healthcare makes a lot of sense, as long as you can try and ensure that the vast majority of people have access to that insurance. And that's what I think we're trying to do. And it takes a while.
We were speaking about the National Health Service there, and you mentioned the UK, and one of the peculiar aspects of the UK is its relationship to the National Health Service, as you said. But can you think of any other ways, when you're looking at the British economy, that it seems so peculiar from anywhere else on the planet?
Everything's peculiar about the British economy. Look, it seems to me that from about the 1970s, Britain made a collective decision to run down its manufacturing base and to replace that with a service economy based around finance, more or less in London. And that was underpinned by openness, by tolerance, by acceptance of immigrants, by acceptance of capital, by open trade, etc. And I think the idea was that as we run down manufacturing, we will run up this service sector in London. This service sector in London will generate a massive surplus, okay? And with that, we will use that massive surplus to ameliorate the regions. The idea, this was before, this idea of killing home rule with kindness, which is an expression in Ireland, right? So that's what we'll do. And then hopefully over time, those regions will recover, the Midlands, the Northeast, the Northwest, and ultimately we'll have a balanced economy. But the dynamo is the service sector. And then as a result of that, there has been active use of the exchange rate to try and keep Britain competitive. I don't think any other country talks about exchange rates in the way in which British economists do as a panacea for things, And that comes from the sort of Wynne-Godley, Cambridge ideas of thinking about the economy. Well, of course, it comes from Keynes. It comes from the very activist Cambridge way of looking at economic management. And so Britain made big bets over the last 40 years. And the big bets were finance, housing, services. And you can't say they haven't been unsuccessful. They have been quite successful at maintaining income per head that's still very high, general GDP level, which is what, the 5th or 6th biggest in the world, This is why I don't understand Brexit, because Brexit's promise is to subdue that huge part of the economy that is finance, to opt out of trading arrangements, to try and rebuild manufacturing in certain areas. And again, I come back to this idea that manufacturing is very, very hard. It's not easy to build things. Like, you take something like this, right? These things are hard to build, right? And to do it perfectly, do it better than the Japanese or the Germans or the French or whatever. And sometimes you can be just too far behind the game. This is my point. So I think that what Britain will have to do, or should do, is ironically do a bit something like Ireland did, attract in foreign capital, right? And realize that maybe you won't be able to build your own brands, but maybe you can just piggyback on other brands. And in order to do that, you have to give up on this idea that you can create national champions, is what the Tories are talking about now.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very tricky thing, because the UK is still 60 million people. It's still huge. It is still a market leader in, the Premiership. New Zealand. I don't say this glibly. I mean, Premiership is an amazing product, right? It's sold all over the world. It attracts in the best footballers, yada, 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 right? It's a service industry. I'm not sure that Britain can go back to heavy or even light manufacturing as easily as Whitehall believes, or seems to believe.
Well, I just wonder if we're believing the hype, and because maybe I'm a bit more skeptical than you are, but just because the Conservative government are saying they want to do this doesn't mean that they're going to do it. And I think Brexit was much more about how to carve up the economy and how to make it much easier to privatize and to take revenue from. I think it was less about this idea of championing British kind of ideals. But yeah, in terms of where we are as the UK economy, it doesn't seem like there's many other economies that are like the British economy and relying so heavily on the idea of rentism and how inefficient and how unproductive that is an economy. Is that something you would agree with?
I know the UK is a rentier economy. There's no doubt of that. And what we can see is not just a rentier economy, but it's captivated by short-termism, really captivated by short-termism. And what you can see is, if you look at, gross value added, I think the only part of the UK that actually has got a surplus is London. So the rest of the UK can't pay for itself. I mean, that's an amazing thing to say for a big, big economy. And of course, the rentier capitalism leads to corruption, the chumocracy, all that sort of stuff.
Which we're seeing now.
Yeah, which you're really seeing now. And there's also things that, as an Irish person, the class system in England. I mean, I was so amazed by it when I lived in London as an adult. I lived in London pulling pints and working on sites as a kid, as a teenager. But when I went as an adult to work in the city, the classism perplexed me. I thought it was kind of a joke initially. The people who spoke with posh accents were kind of regarded as better than the other ones. I really thought it was kind of a joke, and I thought, fuck no, they actually think this. And of course, if you have a very rigid class system and you have a rentier economy, it means that more and more resources are sucked into these kind of buffoon class, like a drone class. But they are like, I used to look at those upper class people, the fuckers with those little rings, those little rings they have on the side. Yeah. And I just thought, man, these people are beyond.
Absolutely. And it's such an interesting perspective you've got there. I was just watching something just recently, and I think by the accent of the lady being interviewed, I think she was in Plymouth. I think she had an Irish kind of hint somewhere in her accent, and she was talking about Boris Johnson, and she said that man of the people thing again. And you hear this consistently with people describing Boris Johnson as a man of the people. And I couldn't think of a poorer definition for someone like him as a man of the people. Is that kind of class system personified?
That fellow wouldn't last a day in Ireland. He really wouldn't. That type of creature. You'd take your children on the far side of the road if you saw him coming up to you.
Well, I think that's what's happening in Scotland, isn't it? There's a clear gulf between his perception in Scotland of him and his government than the rest of the UK.
I think it's fair to say that, when it came to Irish independence and that idea of running your own affairs and whatever, I wouldn't underestimate the grating, how do I put this diplomatically? I wouldn't underestimate how much Irish people hated people who sounded like that. And I mean this viscerally, because of the way in which native people felt that they were being treated by outsiders. And I think people really felt that. I find the Boris Johnson phenomenon hard to understand, because he's definitely not a man of the people. But I also feel that in England, in particular, there is an excessive deference to posh people, to people who speak with a certain accent, and I think that has to change. I really do. It's because I think that if you look at the amount of British prime ministers that went to Oxford and Cambridge, I think Oxford in particular, I think it's almost all of them, apart from John Major, in the last 50 years. And you think, for example, the college that I went to and teach in is Trinity College, which is, meant to be the old Thai university, has only produced one Taoiseach in 100 years. Leo Varadkar, the only one who ever went to Trinity.
Wow.
Because going to the posh university acted against you.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because people said, no, we don't want to be ruled by people the likes of McWilliams and Varadkar who went to Trinity. We want to be, So the way in which our societies have progressed is very different. And I suspect Scotland will progress very like Ireland. I think you will progress very like Ireland.
That's really interesting. I've just finished reading The Raggy Trousered Philanthropist. And it's a fantastic, it's an incredible book. But what came out of that was we're still electing the people, and this was in the 1870s, 1880s. We're still electing the people who've done us down, thinking that somehow the fact that they've had success is going to allow them to be successful for you, rather than realizing that the reason they've been successful is because they've taken advantage of you, and we're now electing them into positions where they're able to really take advantage of us. Was fascinating when you're looking at the types of characters in that book, written 130 years ago, and who we have ruling the government now. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think that if I were Scottish, I would have no fear of an independence movement. I think that with respect to the currency, which comes the issue, you already issue your own banknotes, right? These are very important things. You already issue and use Bank of Scotland notes, right? Initially, you could do what we did, tie to sterling if you wanted, or you could operate like an ERM system, which we did very effectively, where you might have to devalue, but I don't think you will. and then you can progress to a euro situation. I don't think this is as big a deal as people imagine it to be, right? And I think the Scottish nationalists should say, look, this is what we're going to do.
So small nations like Ireland and Scotland, we don't have a large internal market, so a lot of the growth comes from exports.
Has to.
How do you see, or do you see that changing in a world that is more concerned about climate and emissions and these other things that kind of that are always bolted on to exports?
I think that a country like Ireland exports services, so they're actually probably climate quite neutral, I would say, right? So, but we're particularly poor in terms of our own domestic use of resources. I would much prefer to see us. I mean, Scotland has nuclear capacity. That's quite impressive, right? And I would prefer to see us going down that route as well as renewables. And I think that will happen. But your question is, do you go for steady state growth because of your environmental concerns? Maybe yes, maybe no. But it's very, very difficult to predict how environmentally sensitive economic growth rates will come. So in the past, economic growth was very clearly a resource issue, and it always and every time created problems for the environment. I'm not sure that's going to always be the case, but I do think that we need to find a new, much cleaner source of energy, and we need to reduce our energy consumption at the same time. And I would say nuclear is part of that cocktail of solutions. And I think we'll find that over the course of the next 10 years, more and more countries will increasingly use smaller and smaller nuclear power plants. I mean, the Danes and the Swedes have got floating nuclear operations now, and I think that will be something that'll be part of the solution. And I think Scotland's quite ahead of that.
Yeah, certainly when we look at renewables, the Scottish government talks a lot about sustainable growth, and a lot of its growth does come from its kind of very ambitious export strategies. I think they're looking for the Scottish food and drink sector to double from, I think it's about 1.5 billion to 3 billion in the next 10 years. But if every small country in the world is looking to greatly
I know what you mean. Like it is zero sum game. It is. We'll see. Like the one thing we know about the environment is that these are targets that are missed all the time, and my sense is that unless all governments really, really focus on penalizing emissions. So, for example, cars should be made even more expensive than they are. Public transport should be made free, I believe, everywhere, like state schools. The idea that we would charge our young kids, infants, to go to primary school. I think you make public transport free. You issue a perpetual bond to pay for that, and that's just part of the way you do things. And you basically change people's behaviours.
Earlier this year, the Scottish Government created the Advisory Council for Economic Transformation, and a few of folk like you got a call. Mark Blythe and Mariana.
Mark's great.
Yeah. Did you not check your voicemail?
You can't be employing outsiders like me.
What would your advice be to the Scottish Government that are looking 10 years ahead? If you were sitting, next to Mark and Mariana, what would you be saying to the Scottish Government they should look for in that kind of 10-year horizon?
First of all, there's nothing to be afraid of with respect to independence. In fact, from what I can see, it's almost all upside. What you do is, because as I said to you, it's how a nation grows up. It's how you walk tall in the world. It's like you're independent. You are a sovereign nation that deals with its own problems, figures out things. If things go wrong, it's your fault. Things go right, it's probably, you can pat yourself on the back. and you create a vision for your country, and that vision you can actually put together the structures to achieve that. So the first thing is that independent countries work. Okay, that's the first thing, right? And they work extremely well. And Scotland is reasonably homogenous. It's amazingly well situated for renewable energy, for all sorts of areas. Then you can take, okay, the Irish approach, maybe attracting foreign capital, all that sort of stuff. I think just go for it. And if the currency is a big issue, well, you know what? Diffuse that issue. Diffuse it, right? Make it go away. That's the whole idea. And what you've got to appeal to is if you look at small economies, New Zealand, Singapore, Ireland, Israel, all the Finland, Denmark, all these countries, right? They've all achieved extraordinary things off a pretty flimsy base. And what they have achieved is they've managed to liberate the creative impulses of their own people. And I go back to that idea that I started with, that half of the Irish story is about what we felt like ourselves and how we moved to become a much more open society, and how that openness created the catalyst for people backing themselves, for people deciding to set up their own little companies, to do their thing. All of that is there. That's there for the taking. I mean, that's what's possible. Or you can just go through this decline that you're going through at the moment. Like that's the choice. You know, the Scottish decline vis-a-vis Ireland is so obvious economically, you shouldn't even have to go over that again. And it's so unusual because it never had to happen, but it has happened. So I think you just say, we could be this, warts and all, because we've loads of things to fix still, or we could just continue to be a concubine of London. It's your choice.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place for us to finish on. David McWilliams, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And all the best, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
We'll see you soon. Cheers, Wim. Take care.
Thanks, David.
Bye.
Welcome back.
We could just be a concubine of London.
Yeah. I think his important point was make your choice, wasn't it? I really think what David covered in that interview, if we can get more people to see it, will help them decide on what is the best future for themselves and for the country. We've had some brilliant comments come in. I'll bring a couple of them across. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Hashbury. Kairin, thoughts watching that back?
Yeah, you know, I did profoundly disagree with him about our National Health Service. I think it's just not logical to involve profit into our healthcare system. So, yeah, no, completely disagree with that. But you know, pretty much everything else was I agreed with. There was a lot of interesting things. For example, you know, talking about the emigration from Ireland to London, and now they have immigration coming to Ireland. You know, that's really good. And the concept of dissenters, you know, going away, and now they feel more welcome back in Ireland because the change of culture is really interesting as well. You know.
But please do drop any more of your comments in and we'll pull them onto screen. But yeah, definitely that idea around independence being the opportunity for culture to blossom as well as entrepreneurship, I think is really, really powerful, because as we all know, the economy is not just about money. It's about all the other things that make up an economy in a society. And I think we focus too much, you and I are both very guilty of this, but we focus too much on the money and the economy when it comes to an independent Scotland. And I thought he made a really, really salient point there, speaking about the cultural impact. Thanks for that, Charles. Appreciate it. I mean, you know, it's difficult to try and summarize what he said, but I mean, I would paraphrase by saying he said that small countries work, and Scotland will start from a position that's much more favourable than most of the other successful comparable small nations. And he's saying that small nations are successful and they'll continue to be successful. And I think once we're independent, it will be down to those living in Scotland to decide who shares in that success. not some, I think he said, posh Egypts in London. And there's no doubt that the United Kingdom is successful for a small percentage of those who live there. And Scottish independence will allow us to recalibrate our economy, environment, and our society to allocate the prosperity of the nation. And I think that's what he was saying when he was looking back at Ireland. Would you agree, or would you have a different summary of that?
Yeah, and I think coming back to that thing that's important for us really is the subsidiarity. And I believe that when we're independent, we will also take our democracy further down into communities and get people more involved in democracy. I go back to that interview you had with the Russian, who basically said, you can make your economy great, but if your democracy is poor, eventually it's going to have a big effect on how your economy goes. So, I think this is also really, really important. And he was talking as well about how the voting system there has helped to centralize their economy around Dublin as well. So that's a problem for them. Yeah, we don't want that happening in Scotland.
No, and one thing we have to say is that we didn't invite David on so he could tell us how Scotland could be like Ireland. We've invited him on to tell him how Ireland is, so that we can all look at Ireland and think of what are they doing right, what are they doing wrong, what do we want to do, what do we not want to do. And as David said, it is warts and all, and that's what independence allows you to do. It allows you to look at your whole economy and try and fix things. And if it goes well, pat yourself on the back. If it doesn't, then you've got no one to blame. So I think really important points, and I hope that everyone does share the longer version as well as the bite-size version.
Yeah, we should also maybe mention as well that we have a Patreon account. So if you can afford to support us, that would be great as well. And William has just organised our podcasts as well. So you can find us on your favourite podcast app.
Yep, we should have all of our sessions, all of our interviews up there as well, all 22 of them, if you want to look for us now. We're definitely on Spotify, a little bit of a delay getting on the other ones, but we do hope that people can find us a little bit easier that way. Well, for me, there's no doubt that Scotland will be successful. The idea that we can't, because we're too wee, too poor, too stupid, I think it should be completely mocked. And I think we should call it out now as derogatory and insulting. And, the evidence is clear, and all you have to do is look at the country as part of this union and compare it to all the similar smaller nations in Europe. You don't need to be an economist like David McWilliams or politicians to tell you that. You just have to see what is blatantly obvious to those who actually want to see it. And I think that was backed up by everything that David said, and certainly almost all of the comments that we got in tonight. So thanks very much for joining us. And we've Hashberry's just put another link to the bite size. So please do consider joining us on Patreon. That allows us to do much more research, really find the people that we want to bring to you, and also create some documentaries and really, hopefully, help us spread the word about an independent Scottish economy. Thanks very much. And I'll leave the last word. Well, Kairin, you can have the last word, but the last comment is from AGM 0405.
Yeah, I just wanted to say as well that, Scotland would be starting from a much better position than Ireland when we become independent, and much better than Norway. Norway was dirt poor when it became independent. So, yeah, of course we can be independent. Of course.
Yeah. And I think it's important that as a movement, we really do change the narrative that we had. And we've seen it if you've been following a lot of the conversations on Twitter. We're straight away trying to get into the weeds here and defending pensions and who will pay them and where they are. And I've been as guilty as anyone, but I really think we have to say, of course, Scotland will be able to afford to pay its pensions because we'll be a successful small nation. It's what type of success do we want the nation to be? And I think if we can be a little bit more bolder and braver and maybe a little bit more gallus with our conversations, then maybe we'll start cutting through rather than giving a lot of oxygen to people who are doing down in Scotland. Well, that's my final thoughts for this evening. And thanks very much for your time. Thank you to David McWilliams, because I know you're watching somewhere. And Kairin, thanks so much. Until next week. And our show is a really interesting one because we've invited a Labour MSP on to speak about their private bill. And what we want to do, and we've consistently tried to do this since we started, isn't this true, Kairin, is get voices on here who want to speak about things that are happening in Scotland. If they're unionist, we're happy to give them a platform and challenge them, give them the opportunity to say what they see as the future for Scotland. And we've got a Labour MSP, Rhoda Grant, next week speaking about her bill. And we've also, in a couple of weeks' time, we have the economic advisor to the Shadow Chancellor, John MacDonald, from a few years ago. So we are giving people the opportunity, if they want them, to come on and speak to our audience about their vision for Scotland.
Yeah, I think you should also mention that we have Warren Mosler coming soon as well. So.
Yes, and his bite size is already on the YouTube channel. Right, Kairin, you and I are blabbing. Let's go off and do something else and let everyone go. Thanks very much for you all joining us this evening. Until next week, please do consider joining our Patreon and find us on some podcast apps. Thanks so much, and bye.
Bye.